Flaminia Ortenzi, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
I'm really happy you're here. We work together a lot, so this is a cool environment to be talking about what we've been working on for a few years, and that's the Nutritional Value Score, this NVS. And we'll get to what the top scoring food is. It's a food rating system that scores foods from 1 to 100 based on nutrient density and protection from chronic diseases. So stay tuned for that. But just to get started, Flaminia Ortenzi, so you are a researcher. You're currently pursuing your PhD. You're my colleague, worked at Gain for many years with me, and a really super smart person, and really respect your research and work. So to get started, can you remember what really got this idea going for us, this nutritional value score?
Thanks so much for the very nice introduction. This whole concept was born because at Gain, we were looking for a system that was able to help us prioritize foods in policies and programs across diverse countries. And basically, we were not happy with any of the existing systems out there for different reasons. Our system is not perfect either. No system out there is, but we feel that it better represents the priorities that the organization tries to address in its programs and policies, which is why we came up with it. And the main issue that we had with existing systems is that most of them have been developed for high-income country settings, which means they mostly focus on non-communicable disease risk prevention. And that's the case for Nutri-Score, which is very popular in Europe. You see it everywhere in supermarkets, or Health Star Rating in Australia, and many others as well that are perhaps
Hmm.
less common but still out there. And then there's other systems instead which are much more complex, such as the Food Compass or the Nutrient-Rich Food Index, which encompass a broader set of dietary attributes, including also related to nutrient density. But we felt that those as well had limitations that did not resonate with what we were trying to do in prioritizing foods for policies and programs. So that's why we decided to come up with our own system, which still has limitations, of course, and it's work in progress. It will keep evolving for different countries and purposes, but we feel that it better resonates with what our objectives are for programmatic and policy purposes.
Yeah, great summary. I actually remember, so many years ago, I don't know if you remember, before you joined Gain, you had done an internship, and I had done some work with UNICEF looking at these nutrient gaps and how to fill them with different foods, for young children, 6 to 23 months.
Yeah.
And you sent me a message and you said, why don't we expand this globally and to all the populations? Do you remember writing that message?
Yeah. If I think back to the time when I was an intern at Gain, which was how much now, like 5 years ago, it seems
5 years ago.
so far away. But yeah, that's how it all came up. Basically, the idea was we actually started from some prototype versions of the current system that only included certain components. So we first developed something which was called the Priority Micronutrient Density Score, which is also published, and that was derived from your UNICEF work, and it only included essential nutrient density attributes. And then we felt that that was also insufficient to capture the double burden of malnutrition, and we decided to expand upon it even further and include the NCD component. So it really
Yeah.
was a progressive process, moving from a simpler version to a more complex version to an even more complex version. And who knows what comes next? Maybe we'll add other components in the coming months or years to the same system.
Hmm. Yeah, I just want to say that's just some sort of inspiration for others who are kind of starting their career. You can get places by initiation, right? Like you can have inspiration and say, why don't we try this? And it can actually lead towards other things. Because the initial score was really this priority micronutrient density. It wasn't even protein and omega-3s or anything. It was like, six vitamins and minerals. I think we had iron, zinc, calcium, folate, vitamin B12, and vitamin A, right? So we had basically
Right.
just six. These were commonly, lacking. They're prevalent deficiencies around the world. And so we really thought when we got another work stream looking at this, we got a bit more funding. We were thinking, how do we do this more holistically? How do we incorporate the protein, the quality, the omega-3s, the fiber, the calorie density, and then all of these sophisticated things around nutrient ratios, which we'll get into. So, okay, high level. What is the NVS? How is it composed? How do we produce the score, which is this ultimately the score from 1 to 100, where 100 is the highest score, the highest nutritional value, 1 is the lowest score, lowest nutritional value. What are the components that make this up?
So the NVS has 7 components. Each of these can actually be taken individually to guide policies and programs to identify foods that score best against that specific component, which I think is a really cool thing about the NVS. But then you can also bring them all together with the final algorithm that is kind of a weighted mean of all of the 7 components that are normalized on a scale of 1 to 100, as you said. So
Hmm.
these are components related to essential nutrient density, partially derived from our previous system, as you said, but also expanded upon it. So there's vitamins, minerals, we have protein, we have essential fatty acids, and then we have instead components that relate to non-communicable disease risk. And those are calories, fiber, and we also have nutrient ratios, which are predictors of non-communicable disease risk. The cool thing is that for each of these subcomponents, there's a set of subcomponents included within them. So we have a long list of vitamins and minerals included, for
Hmm.
example, which makes our system unique compared to other systems out there. For protein, we don't just take into account protein quantity, but also the quality. So we use the DS score to assess biodigestibility of protein. And then for omega 3s as well, we take into account both long chain and short chain. So each of these in reality go at a very granular level, which allows you to assign weights to each of the various components, subcomponents, and subcomponents to tailor the system to whatever situation, context, or population group you're targeting. So, for
Hmm.
example, in the current system, we assign 20% of weights to vitamins and minerals. You could assign 40% of weights to vitamins and minerals if you were targeting a situation of high vitamin and mineral deficiencies, for example, in a specific country
Hmm.
or population group.
And to
So I think
clarify,
it's
that's
really
20.
flexible.
We have 20% towards vitamins and 20% towards
Yeah.
minerals currently.
Yeah.
40% overall, but you're saying you could go even higher if you're really
Yeah.
looking at
Exactly.
these undernutrition areas where vitamin and mineral deficiencies are widespread.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the idea. The cool thing is that it's a map of 7 components, but you can really play around with them and combine them in different ways to tailor the system to whatever context or population group you're working in. So it's
Yeah.
very flexible, and even the components included could be modified. You could take out a vitamin or add a new one. You could decide to focus only on 6 out of the 7 components if you're not very interested in one of them. So yeah, I think it's a playground that you can basically do anything with.
Yeah, and talk about this a little bit. So we had a another work stream where we were looking at the population of adolescent girls and women between the ages of 15 and 49 in low income, lower income, kind of low and middle income regions. So we had Latin America, we had I think sub-Saharan Africa, and then we had South and Southeast Asia. And we tailored the score. So we did a little bit of reviewing of what is the nutritional situation in those contexts and how should these components be weighted when we're thinking of that in the context of their nutritional challenges, right? And what did we find? What was the general takeaway there?
Exactly. So this was a very interesting experiment. I was personally expecting big changes in the final scores and big changes in the algorithm based on the local context. And in reality, what we realized is that the actual basic score, as we developed it initially, was already good enough to assess most of the nutritional problems in these regions. So the
Hmm.
scores that we obtained and the final algorithms that we obtained for each of these regions were pretty close to the original ones. So that really, for me, if anything, although, I was a little bit disappointed because after doing so much work in reviewing the literature and identifying the nutritional gaps and everything, we pretty much got the same results. But if anything, this really showed us what the strength of the NVS is, which is that it already represents the global evidence as to which are the major priorities for nutrition and health worldwide. So
Yeah.
it's already good enough. It can obviously be made even better through small refinements here and there, depending on context. But yeah, this was proof that what we have already is good to represent the global evidence.
Yeah, and so I'll just elaborate a little bit. So we looked at things like which types of nutrients were the population inadequate in, which ones did they have deficiencies in, what was their chronic disease burden, whether it was diabetes, heart disease, overweight, obesity. And so we adjusted the algorithm. For example, if iron for women, if because iron was a bit of a bigger issue in anemia, we increased the weight of iron in the mineral score, right? So it wasn't just this all minerals are equal. We had a distribute variation depending on which nutrient. And we looked at overall, I think the combination of these like nutrient adequacy, nutrient density versus the chronic disease prevention, that weighting, I think, can actually make a bit of a difference. But the thing is, when we designed this system, initially we were really thinking of these low and middle income countries. And so the algorithm was already tailored for that context. And so what we found was that some
Exactly.
of the rankings changed. So it was a little bit more granular, it was a little bit more nuanced, and sometimes the guidance was a little bit different. But overall, the big picture was relatively the same. And where I see some of the biggest changes is if you go from this issues of a lot of undernutrition versus the chronic disease burden. And then you can sort of see some shifting of the scores. So we can get into that. When you shift, how much do you weight the fiber amount, right? How much do you weight the calorie density? How much do you weight these nutrient ratios, which if we get into it, sort of the saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio. It's the sodium to potassium
Exactly.
ratio, the carb to fiber. Gives you an indication of how uh, the nutritional quality of that food and how it's going to basically impact the cardiometabolic health of the population. So, okay. So let's get into a little bit more on the food composition data. That's a word people who don't work in this field may not really understand. But what was the process here? You led this effort. We had to figure out how do you actually get the data for all these foods to rate them, right? We had 289 foods in the paper. We're now at, I think, almost 1,800 foods when we add
Yeah,
other regions and
correct.
traditional foods, and our goal is to expand this to the US and beyond, maybe Italy, right? What was the challenge of finding this data, and how did you go about that?
This, I think, is probably the main bottleneck when it comes to nutrient profiling globally. Unfortunately, the data that we have in most countries is quite limited. There is a small number of foods included in national or regional food composition tables. And even when the number of foods is large, there's lots of gaps for specific nutrients, and some nutrients are not even included at all. So this has been, I think, perhaps the most important challenge throughout the entire process. And what we did was to come up with a system that allows us to fill those gaps. And in some cases, it's quite simple. There are some foods for which it's possible to find a close proxy. So I don't know, for example, a specific dark green leafy vegetable, if there's a gap here and there for vitamin E or iron, you may be able to replace it with a similar vegetable, botanically and nutritionally similar vegetable. For other foods, instead, it's very complicated and it's not possible to find good proxies. Like, I don't know, weird tropical fruits from sub-Saharan Africa that I didn't even know before starting this work. And in that case, the only thing you can do is to use food group averages, which has been really the key to solving the problem that we were facing. So, trying to find an average that represents overall a food group or sub food group for a specific attribute that can be used to fill in the gaps. There's other ways to fill in gaps in nutritional data, but this we felt was a way to impute data that was still close enough to reality and allowed us not to mess up with the final scores too much. And obviously, it's
Mhm,
one thing when you have just one nutrient gap for food, and it's another thing when you have I don't know, 10 nutrient gaps for a food. And then it's also a choice of whether you want to include that food or not. There may be value in doing so because perhaps it's, I don't know, a superfood for iron content, but there may be also a downside, which is that the final score will not be that accurate overall. So it's also a judgment call at some point. And we decided to, let's say, stay in the middle ground and include as many foods as possible when we felt that the final score was still representative of the reality of things, and exclude those foods for which the data was so poor quality or so little that it was really impossible to provide an accurate score.
mhm,
So yeah, overall, it was a mix of proxies, averages across food groups, and also the literature. That has been another challenge for me because, especially for foods like insects or like, again, weird tropical vegetables that I've never heard of, Unfortunately, the only last resort was to look into individual papers from local universities and researchers, which again is a struggle because you never know what the quality of the assessments that were made is. You never know, what the lab conditions were. So there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of limitations and a lot of uncertainties. But I think the database that we have now provides a good basis for building upon in the future. And I've never seen anything of its kind. So that's something that I'm actually really proud of as part of this work.
Yeah, you've done a huge amount of work, and I'll throw a shout out to Kirsten Damerow as well, who helped us compile a lot of the regional
Definitely.
data. And we'll get into a little bit more of the use of this stuff, which we have a lot of different thoughts about and some work in process. But let's talk about the findings, okay? So we looked at this at the individual food level and we looked at the food groups. So starting with the food groups, what are the top scoring foods? Can you remember the food groups that we rated?
Yeah, sure. In fact, the top scoring foods were perhaps not surprising for me. That's what I was expecting. And those were primarily, dark green leafy vegetables, which are nutrient powerhouses, same as for organ meats, and then fish and seafood. And especially
Mm-hmm.
the dried versions of these foods, I think represent really a key resource, especially in low and middle income countries, because they're snacks that are easy to preserve, even in conditions where, I don't know, there's no cold chains or there's a high heat and humidity. So they're really, a resource to leverage, especially over there. But there's many other
Mm-hmm.
foods that score well too. It's not just these three food groups.
Yeah. Okay. So we got dark green leafy vegetables. So these are things like kale, spinach, romaine lettuce, right? Organ
Yeah.
meats, liver, right? What else? What other organs
Yeah.
did we include in there?
I think we included all of them, and I think all of them pretty much scored well. But liver definitely topped the ranks. There was also though kidney, lungs. We have heart. We have a tripe. A lot of them scored well.
S-
But yeah, liver is a
spleen.
nutrient powerhouse.
I think we had
Spleen,
spleen.
yeah, yeah,
Yum. Okay. For all those people who love organs. Now, I don't love the taste of organs, but we can't deny their nutrient density.
yeah,
Okay. So then fish and seafood. So talk about some of these fish and seafood. So we had fatty fish. So the fish that were kind of higher in those omega-3s, right? And then also
yeah.
the smaller fish. What were some of the highest scoring fish and seafood foods?
Yeah, so for fish and seafood, definitely fatty fish, especially because that's the only category that scored well against the omega 3s component. In reality, no other food group scored well against that component. And then the
Mm-hmm.
small fish, another, like I think, super important resource, even freshwater small fish from low and middle income countries, which is easy to catch, it's abundant, and it's already present in local cultures and culinary traditions. So those as well scored particularly well. The scores were less high for lean fish, such as, I don't know, tilapia or cod or other types of lean fish. But overall, fatty fish and small fish were really, again, a nutrient powerhouse to leverage in these countries.
Yeah, and it's not all about the lean, right? I think that's surprising. So oftentimes lean meats, for example, rank higher, but when you look at the
Yeah,
overall fish and seafood category, it's actually the fatty fish, right? It's the fish that
exactly.
the salmon, the mackerel that have the omega-3 content, and that's much more bioavailable in the DHA and the EPA
Yeah.
than in the plant sources, which are still very nutritious, but they have ALA and it's not as bioavailable, right? Okay,
Mhm.
now, some of the lowest scoring foods. Remember which ones what are at the bottom here? What are the foods that really should be avoided or limited at least for most people?
I think at the bottom of the ranks we have both foods that should be avoided and foods that are simply not nutrient dense. So not necessarily to be avoided, but not, let's say, to be consumed as a major part of the diet. So we have
Mhm.
foods like, instant noodles and sweets and soft drinks, which I think score 1. That is really the lowest possible score on the scale. But then we
Yeah.
also have things like starchy staples, and starchy staples are an important part of healthy diets if consumed in moderate amounts and following dietary guidelines. And same applies to things like watermelon or coconut, which may be surprising for some people because this is fruit and fruit is supposed to be healthy. And that's what we're taught since we're kids. But in reality, there's differences within the food group of fruits, and there's fruits that are nutrient dense and others that are primarily water and sugar, like
Yeah.
watermelon.
Mhm.
So yeah, perhaps some of these may be surprising. Not all of them are bad though. I mean, it's perfectly fine to eat watermelon as part of a healthy and balanced diet. It's just that it shouldn't be
Mhm.
your primary choice for everyday consumption.
Right. Totally agree. Okay. So we have these soft drinks that I think one of the groups was called baked grain-based sweets, which are those like dessert type foods with refined grains. You have instant noodles like ramen and others. You have packaged ultra processed salty snack foods, chips, things like that, refined grains in general. So, like you said, they may not even be ultra processed, but just like the white rice is not the highest nutritional value, right? So, okay, now let's get into some of the really interesting results. I think people have been really surprised and interested to hear the number one food that scored 100. Can you tell us what the food is that scored 100 on this system?
Yeah, that's dried okra, and that has been a surprise for me too. I mean, I think it's dried okra in this specific selection, but it may be another food if we took a different data set. But that's just to say that vegetables that are dried and consumed in their dried form as a snack are super nutritious, and as I said earlier, a real resource for local populations. These foods are accepted, they're consumed by kids, they're consumed by women of reproductive age as part of their daily diets as a snack, as we eat chips in the West. Unfortunately, we should all be eating dried okra instead.
Yeah, it's funny because I get this dried okra at Trader Joe's in the States. And there's a bit of added oil, so that's I think it would probably bring the score down a
Mm,
bit, but in general, you can also find these dried okra products without a lot of added oil, and so they're
yeah,
very high in fiber, they're extremely high in potassium, and there's no sodium, so that sort
yeah,
of sodium-potassium ratio is low as it can possibly be because you're getting all that potassium and really none of the sodium, so that's why it's also rich in vitamins and minerals, and so that's why it scores well. Okay, so
exactly.
now what can we do with these results? So we have this score. It's really kind of for individual use. It's very interesting, but we set it up for programs and policies. We thought about this for potentially being adapted for front of package labeling. So how do you sort of score foods and show the consumer? We've talked about mobile apps so that individuals can kind of understand which are the most nutritious foods or foods to contribute to nutrient density and metabolic health. So what are these in terms of just the nutritional health kind of implications? What can we do with this score?
Everything and anything, as you've mentioned. Well, the most immediate thing that we actually developed it for was for implementation in policies and programs, and that's the whole reason why the idea of the NVS came about, and the idea of the previous systems that we developed together came about. So, really, to prioritize which are the most nutrient dense foods that can be targeted in policies and programs locally. So, we're talking about, for example, consumer demand generation programs. Which foods should we be raising awareness about among local communities for people to consume more of? Or it
Hmm.
could be market based programs. So, which foods do we want suppliers and vendors in low and middle income countries to have on their market stalls to offer to local communities? It could be anything. It could be supply chain interventions. Where do we want to invest budgets from the public and private sector? Do we want to promote the, I don't know, the supply chain of kidney beans or the supply chain of milk and dairy products? So those are the kind of decisions that many organizations, not just GAIN, are facing every day, and many policy authorities are also facing every day. So I think it's very useful for informing those decisions. And I know that it's, in general, we should be promoting healthy diets. We should be promoting diets that are balanced and that include moderate amounts and adequate amounts of different food groups. But it's also true that people around the world do not follow dietary guidelines. And it is also true that, we are told to eat 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day, and very few people do that. I probably eat 6 or 7, but I'm definitely a minority.
Yeah,
So it's important to not just focus on the overall dietary picture, but also to promote those specific nutrient dense foods that can help boost dietary adequacy and quality, even within the context of a world where people do not follow dietary guidelines overall. So for
right.
me, that's the most immediate use. But then we started talking lately also of other potential options. So like the front of package labeling. I don't know if you want to go a little bit into that, or if I should continue. But
Yeah, let's
yeah,
talk about that. Because that's
yeah.
one of the things. So we think about Nutri-Score and Health Star rating. So those are right on the package. People see them if you're shopping online. They see this, kind of A rating or a B or C, so on. And so I think there's this interest in how do we communicate to the consumer about which ones are sort of healthier options to be consumed and encouraged, promoted, and which ones should be moderated, which ones should be limited? So how do we go about this, and how is this sort of translated to consumers?
Yeah, so that's for example, this is something that I see every day living in France at supermarkets. I have the Nutri-Score on every packaged product that tells me whether a food is ranked as an A or a D in terms of healthfulness. And I think from a personal perspective, this is in quotes useful because it gives an immediate sense of whether a food can fit within a healthy and balanced diet or not. And there are lots of evidence and studies that show that actually these systems do work in terms of at least raising awareness about whether a food is healthy or unhealthy. Not necessarily about influencing choices. People still choose according to other food choice motives, but at least in terms of raising awareness. So I think it's
Hmm.
a useful public health policy instrument that can be leveraged. However, the existing systems are not exactly coherent with what's considered to be a healthy diet globally. For example, it's often the case that I walk into a supermarket in France and I see a package of cereals that are rated an A, and then I look into the ingredients list and the actual food composition data, well, nutrient information data, and what I see is a very high level of sugar and hydrogenated oils and whatever additives and that I don't even know the names of. So
Hmm.
that's, this is an incoherent signal that's being sent to the consumer. So it's important to ensure that that front of package labeling is not only communicating a message, but communicating a message that's reflective of the actual evidence and not a biased message that the industry is able to manipulate by modifying the ingredients list and, managing to get an A rating despite the food not actually being worth an A rating.
Right.
So I think it's powerful, but it's also a bit dangerous and it needs to be done
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I also think about some examples with Nutri-Score where you have sardines that score like a C. I think sometimes they may score a
Yeah,
D. And that's one of those where those are some of the most nutrient dense fish and seafood because they're small. You are eating the whole fish. So you have the bones where
yeah,
you get the calcium, even the eyeballs, you have vitamin A, and you're very high in DHA and EPA. And so there are a lot of these examples. And the reason for that is because they're not considering the nutritional quality very much. It's a very simplified system
yeah,
that is essentially about calorie density and the fiber and saturated fat. There's not really a lot more to those scores. So okay, that's the front of package labeling. So you can have a traffic light system, right? You could say green light, consume these as much as you want. These are great. Keep including them in your diet to some extent. There's always nuance around maybe the quantity. You don't want to overconsume too much, right? But then these yellow or amber foods is sort of okay. These are sort of moderated. They're part of the diet, but they're not gonna. You should not be necessarily consuming them every day or for every meal. And then you have the red foods or these limit these foods. They're more of a treat. Think of them as for other purposes in terms of pleasure, enjoyment, social, cultural things, right? But they're not your staple,
exactly.
right? And I'll just highlight for people who sort of wonder about these. If you are a endurance athlete, there's always context that changes which foods, right? You may want the
Of
most energy
course.
dense foods if you're backpacking out on a mountain. It's a different story. So we're just talking about in general on average when we look at populations and what their
Yeah.
nutrition challenges are, right? So now we've looked at that. So what about like a mobile app? So what is the idea here? Can we have a system that users can understand if they have an app and they scan a food and they look at the healthfulness of this food?
That's also something to explore, definitely. There's already apps out there that use existing systems to give a quick, as we said, green, yellow, or red score to consumers to inform their choices. Many of them are linked to barcodes, so it's easy for consumers to simply identify the food by pointing their mobile to the package and then get an immediate message about, what they should be doing with that food. Should they be buying it at all? Should they be consuming it in moderation, as we said, or is it something that can be part of their daily diet? I think that's also very useful, especially in a world where literally everybody owns a mobile phone and not just in high income countries, but also in low and middle income countries. So it can have a large potential, I think, in terms of public health interventions. Perhaps even more than the way that we position foods on shelves, because people are sometimes acting according to other food choice motives, and it's difficult to nudge consumers. I think something like an
Mm,
app which is so practical and which sits onto a device that everyone owns, like a mobile phone, can be particularly effective. So perhaps the NVS could become the new mobile phone app that informs consumers' choices. Who knows?
That would be great. Okay. But what is the challenge now when you actually go from this idea to implementation? So, what do we have to do to get all the data for this? Because there's a lot. We're not just looking at
Yeah.
calories, salt, saturated fat, and fiber. We're looking at a huge, huge variety of compounds and dietary factors from nutrients to other things that are protective of health. So, how do we gather this data so that we actually have all of the foods in a country's food supply and are able to create a score for those?
That's a big question. In some countries, it may be relatively easy. For example, in the US, where there's a large database that provides data against not just the common nutrients, as we said, but also a wide range of vitamins and minerals, omega 3s, and additives as well for some foods. But then in other countries instead, where there's a data desert, meaning that not even the most common nutrients are available often, and where the food industry is not well regulated in terms of what they need to measure and what they need to report on food packaging, and where a lot of the foods are even sold unpackaged, so in loose form, this will be a real challenge. So I think the main point here will be to develop food composition databases as much as possible, invest in data collection, compilation, and verification across countries. And then obviously collaboration from the private sector is essential because many small and medium-sized enterprises do not even have the capacity to track some of these components, but large companies do have laboratories and the capacity to do so. So they need to be willing, obviously, to contribute to the scoring system being applied. So I think it's
Hmm.
a matter of investing in food composition data collection, but also partnering with industry in this case.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're obviously biased because we developed the system. We think it's great. But let's talk about some of the limitations or maybe some of the things that you were not happy with. So no system is perfect. You said that at the start. What's imperfect about this? What were the foods or food groups that you felt like it's still kind of struggles with?
I think one of the main imperfect points, let's call it that way, that we recently realized actually by expanding the database and moving from about 300 foods to about 1,800 foods is the fact that the NVS is a relative scoring system, which means that there's no absolute assessments of foods, but rather the scores depend on what's included in your dataset. So if
Hmm.
the data set is skewed towards one food group or another, that affects the final scores. And this is what happened to us recently, where, for example, the dairy scores actually went down by a lot when we included in our new larger data set a much larger pool of indigenous and traditional foods that are very nutrient dense. So what happened
Hmm.
is that moderately nutrient dense foods like dairy ended up being lower in the rankings. So that's just to say that for me, there needs to be a very large pool of foods that includes a little bit of everything, high ranking foods, low ranking foods, moderate ranking foods, to ensure that we have a balanced distribution of the scores. So that's
Hmm.
definitely one point that I think
Yeah.
needs to be improved.
So just to elaborate, it's when it's kind of skewing. We have all these highly nutritious foods. So if you think about
Yeah,
traditional foods, there's insects, there's kind of wild crop relatives that are very nutrient dense, and they are bringing the overall density, like the bar, they're raising the bar very
yeah,
high, right? And we're not including a lot of these nutrient poor foods. So when we look at a full food supply, if we're looking at the thousands of foods, for example, in the US, and we include, which is 60 plus percent from ultra processed
yeah,
somewhat junk foods, right? Then the overall scores for the other foods will actually go up and be a bit higher. And then the
exactly.
more foods you add, the more stable those scores are. So,
Yeah,
and just as an example, when we add all these other foods, dried okra is still at the top. Now there are a couple of species. I think there's some organs or some insect species and some fish species that score right up there. I think there's a fish species that scores about 100 as well. When you look at some of the
yeah,
indigenous traditional foods, right? But this sort of tells you, this is a system. It's we normalize in general so that we have a way of understanding what that means on a sort of relative. It's very intuitive to understand 100 being the best and one being the lowest
exactly.
score. So that's why we do that. Okay, so now what about specific foods, or were there any challenges or any things that you think this system, like, some people have commented on whole grains score kind of
Mhm.
moderate, right? They're not the highest scoring foods. That could be, potentially a challenge in the system. There's a lot of thoughts around breakfast cereals, whether the
Mhm.
fortification, how much do you weigh those? I've heard things on both sides. We should be saying the vitamins and minerals added should be just the same as other intrinsic nutrients. And then people who
Yeah.
say we shouldn't even consider the added vitamins and minerals because they're ultra processed foods. So, what do
Yeah.
you take away from this in terms of some of those scores for things like whole grains that or breakfast cereals that people may disagree with those scores for?
Yeah, for whole grains, I feel a little bit the same way, meaning that whole grains do not rank very high, but it's also true that whole grains may not be the most nutritious option to promote in countries where grains are generally widely consumed already. So, in many low and middle income countries, for example, grains are really the basics of every diet for every person, which means that a policy or program that tries to improve diet quality may not want to go there if they're trying to improve nutrient adequacy, for example. So I feel like, yes, whole grains definitely need to be part of healthy diets and they should not be scored among the lowest ranking foods. But at the same time, perhaps they're not the main target that we should be pursuing when we're trying to improve diet quality across countries. There's
And
other
even
foods that should be prioritized.
Yeah, I like that take,
Yeah.
but also even in the high income context, grains are really a dominant source
Yeah.
of calories, right? Refined grains, of course, though, right? So
Primarily
I
refined,
think
yeah.
that there's,
Mhm.
I think that there's this sort of issue of we do consume a lot of grains in general,
Yeah,
and it's not a food group that we're necessarily. Of course, whole grains we don't consume a lot of whole grains, so those can be emphasized. But I think
right.
there's that like when you're looking at the nutritional quality the score is, pretty objective. It's looking at the content in those
Yeah.
foods, and so it's hard to, if I'm gonna talk about some of my interesting scoring foods, I think for me, I look at cheese, which scores kind of moderately
Mhm.
poor for most of them. There are cheeses that score higher, like paneer,
Yeah,
but I think that's another one where it's sort of like, okay, this is like I think cheese is generally has a lot of positive associations with
definitely.
health outcomes, right? But again, it's sort of
Yeah,
the system is looking at all of these components. Now, there's things we could do if we have more data and we can spend more time on this. Like we can include potentially a component for fermented foods that contain live active cultures for gut health, right?
yeah,
So the yogurts, the cheeses, the kefir, the pickles, the kraut, kimchi that are fermented with salt and water as opposed to vinegar. So we can make some of those
exactly.
adjustments. So there's one other food. Now there's another one that gets a lot of talk in some of the more low carb or animal based communities versus
Mhm,
the plant based and vegan communities. And there's a lot of talk about red meat, unprocessed red meat.
mhm.
So this score is relatively high, right? We have a score of
Yeah,
about 59. It's in the moderate to moderately high score. It's not the top score by any means, but it has a pretty relatively high score. And at the same time, you see unsweetened soy milk scores 61, which is like just above
yeah.
that. So you're kind of offending both camps here. We're saying beef is actually has pretty high nutritional quality, and the plant-based community says, well, beef has all these risk of chronic diseases, and it's has fat and saturated fat, and what about the links to cancer, and what about cardiovascular disease, diabetes? And at the same time, we say, look, unsweetened soy milk, tofu, edamame, these are really high nutritional quality foods. They're scoring well, and
Yep.
some people push back on that and say, what, like this bean milk is going to score higher than beef? Why would that happen? This system is garbage. So where do you stand on that? What do you tell us what you think about the beef and the soy products?
Yeah. So I think, well, first of all, the reason why both beef and soy score moderate to high is different reasons in reality. So each of these score well against specific components in the system. And then it happens to be so that the final scores are similar. But in reality, the final scores are hiding what's behind them, which is the individual scores against the subcomponents. So this is just to say that neither beef nor soy milk should be demonized, but both of them should be can be part of healthy diet. So, for example, let's look at two foods that are well, I can't make a meal with beef and soy milk in yeah no I don't think it works as a pairing, but but technically the idea would be that you should be comparing different foods against all of the components, and you should be then pairing them to complement one another so that in the end you have an overarching nutritional profile which is balanced. So let's think of two other foods which perhaps are more compatible, like vegetables and meat or vegetables and fish. fish. So in this case, again, we have foods that score high, but they score high for different reasons. Vegetables may score high because of fiber and because of low calorie density and because of certain vitamins and minerals. And then meat may score high because of vitamin and mineral density, protein density, etc. And then if you put them together, you end up feeding the whole circle of the various components. So the reason why they score the same is different reasons. Both of them are worthy of being in a healthy diet, and we should be considering consumption of different foods of animal and source origin to complement the profiles of each.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you look overall, like we don't need to score 100. Like we don't have to just consume all foods that are like 90 or above. That's not what this is
Exactly.
purpose. That's sort of like if we're talking about sort of which food do you invest in if you're gonna try to
Yeah.
have the biggest impact, right? We're gonna look at a food and you have certain options, right? But what you're saying is it's the combination, and we can actually use this system to rate the overall diet, a meal, for example, and it can
Mm.
look at all of those components together. I'll just say that for those people who kind of wonder about beef, beef is penalized for a few different things. So the saturated fat to unsaturated fat ratio penalizes beef that is more fatty. So leaner beef scores higher than fatty beef because of that. The calorie density in general, we didn't penalize just normal calorie density. We penalized foods that had pretty high calorie density. So the higher
Mhm.
calorie density, the really fatty meat like fatty beef or fatty red meat, that's also penalized, right? There's
Yeah.
also other there's other components when you look at there's no fiber in beef, so it's not
Mm.
scoring well on the fiber component, right? It doesn't have a lot of vitamins, so it's not necessarily scoring the highest on the vitamin component as well. But then it scores well on some of the minerals, right? You have pretty high scoring for iron and zinc. You have pretty high scoring for protein quality. So, anyways, it's just to say we're looking at this. It's not perfect. You can, of course, you can create examples and kind of pick things apart and say, well, how come this scored this way?
Mm.
One thing I'm sort of pleased to see is I do see relatively balanced criticisms from different camps. So I see the
Mhm.
I see the low carb camp kind of criticizing some things, and then the plant based side is saying the opposite. And I'm not to say
Yeah.
that everything should always just be somehow in the middle of everything, but in general, we've offended people on both sides with saying that actually dark leafy greens and okra is really really nutritious. We should be eating these, and soy as well, right? And at the same time, beef is pretty
Yeah.
nutritious in a lot of ways. Like it's not all populations, right? Not everyone needs to eat beef, but it's sort of like when you score it in terms of the nutritional quality, it has a lot of beneficial properties, right? Okay.
Exactly. And perhaps another thing to clarify is that some of these foods are aggregate foods, as we call them, which means that within a name, there's actually a lot of variation. For example, as you said, we're talking about beef, and that's what appears on the high level figures of the paper. But in reality, behind that beef element, there's something like 20 or 30 different data entry points because we included beef with different types of fat, with fat levels. We included beef cooked in different ways. For example, there may be fried beef that is obviously fattier compared to beef cooked on a grill. So it's also important to consider that we try reflecting what people actually eat and a variety of things that may be part of a diet. So that food may be the summary of a lot of variation behind it. And if we were to score those individual data entry points in the food composition data, we would probably get a range, of beef scores from 60 up to 80 for the leanest and the simply grilled with no added salt or fat.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we are presenting these foods. We really analyze them in the form that's commonly consumed. So people have commented about, well, what about like, is it just the raw beef or the raw meat?
Oh, no, no.
That's not the case. We're looking at really the form consumed. So it's prepared in different ways. It's cooked, and
Yeah,
people have also commented on the dried foods. We're not the reason we're scoring these foods and saying these foods are highly nutritious even though they're dried is that these are consumed dried. Dried
yeah,
okra is consumed without being rehydrated. Dried fish are consumed that way very often, right?
yeah,
Sometimes they're consumed in multiple ways, and so for example, if we have a vegetable like carrots, we will consider the raw form and the cooked form as well, and we kind of look at both of those.
exactly.
So we are looking at these in terms of the prepared form that people are consuming, which I think is
Yeah,
helpful because you could say, well, beef scores, it's not going to have a lot of sodium because people haven't added the salt on it yet. No, we actually consider the products with the salt added, right? The general way that
Yeah,
those are performed. And what you're saying is
exactly.
there's a lot of variation. So we have these food groups, and if you look at deer, some of the lean cuts of venison and whatnot, they're higher scoring, right? And then some of the fattier cuts of meat are score much lower, right? So there is this range, and I think that's important to keep in mind. So the last thing I want to close on is there's been a lot of interest in using these as a functional unit in environmental impact assessments. So if we look at the environmental footprint of foods, right? We also
Yes.
think about this in terms of the price of foods. The price per, the quantity you get in terms of the volume or the mass, right? That's one thing, but we know the nutritional value varies, so this can be sort of used to standardize nutritional value or quality across foods for different purposes. So you can tell us a little bit about the use case for environmental impact assessments and for price or cost and affordability assessments.
Exactly. Yeah. This is something that's very dear to my heart because it's also related to my PhD research. So the idea is basically to move from traditional life cycle assessment approaches or affordability assessment approaches where foods are scored on a mass or energy basis, as you said, to accounting for the nutritional value of those foods. And this is very important because what we see commonly in the literature is, for example, 1 kilogram of beef being compared to 1 kilogram of rice, or even within the same food group, 1 kilogram of carrots being compared to 1 kilogram of spinach. And these elements are very different and play very different roles in diets and have very different nutrient density. So that means that for the same environmental cost, if we want to call it that way, or for the same monetary cost, we're getting different value. So it's very important to assess foods based on the value that they bring to their main goal and objective, which is that of nourishing humans, and not just in terms of amounts or volume, because that's not the purpose of food. The same term that the term functional unit in fact means to quantify the function of something, and the
Hmm.
function of clothing is to be worn and to protect people from cold, and the function of food is that of nourishing humans. So quantifying the value of food and its environmental impact in terms of kilograms is a very reductionist approach. So I believe that a system like the NVS, which is really holistic and captures the value of food comprehensively across undernutrition and non-communicable disease protection, can be of value by when integrating it into environmental impact and affordability assessments. And we've seen that in some of the examples that we recently led at the Global Alliance, where we've seen, for example, that we kind of reverted the common narrative about certain foods in environmental impact assessments. Like, I don't know, in some of our work, for example, fish and even ruminant meat score better than foods that typically score very well in environmental impact assessments, like legumes or or nuts and seeds, which in our case often have a higher impact proportionately because they're less nutrient dense. So because that the environmental cost is higher per unit nutritional value.
Yeah, exactly. You're kind of standardizing these in a way that is with their purpose to nourish us, right? What about in terms of the price of foods? Do we have any way of assessing that as well?
Yeah, it's basically the same concept. We normally assess the price of food on a per calorie or per gram basis, sometimes on a per protein basis as well. But value for money should not be assessed based on volume. Again, I mean, I could be buying a large amount of rice for a very small price, but in reality, the value that I'm getting out of that is small because white rice is generally not very nutritious, although it can be part of a healthy diet. So again, same concept. You should be assessing the value for money based on what the food is actually providing in terms of nutrient density. So assessing, for example, the affordability on a cost or on an income basis using the nutritional value as the standardization reference unit is a much more valuable insight to provide to consumers or to policymakers, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. There's a lot of uses for this, so I think this is just a start. We'll start integrating these into these, and we've already started. We have a paper under review, of course, on the using
Yeah.
this as sort of nutritional life cycle assessment, and more in the works. So you can read the paper at Journal of Nutrition. It's called Nutritional Value Score, rates foods based on nutrient density and non-communicable disease prevention. And I'll put a link in the show notes. So Flaminia Ortenzi, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.